The cameras were rolling, the audience was cheering, and then 19-year-old Jordan Martinez stood at the Family Feud podium with the quiet uncertainty of someone who had spent their entire life questioning the most fundamental aspects of their identity, not by choice, but because decisions made about their body when they were too young to consent had created a lifelong struggle between who they were told they should be and who they felt themselves to be. When Steve Harvey asked about decisions other people made that affected your whole life, Jordan's response, delivered with the careful honesty of someone who had learned that even the most well-intentioned medical interventions can create profound identity conflicts, would reveal the complex reality of growing up intersex in a world that demands everyone fit into clearly defined categories. "When I was born, the doctors and my parents decided what gender I would be," Jordan had said, their voice carrying 19 years of questions about bodily autonomy, medical ethics, and the recognition that the most personal decisions about their body and identity had been made by others before they were old enough to have any say in the matter. "They chose wrong, and now I have to live with consequences of a decision I never got to make." The studio had fallen into a thoughtful silence as everyone present began to understand that they were witnessing something rarely discussed publicly: the complex intersection of medical necessity, parental responsibility, and individual autonomy that defines the experience of people born with intersex conditions who must navigate identity, relationships, and self-acceptance in bodies that were surgically altered before they could consent to those changes. Jordan Martinez had been born with an intersex condition, specifically androgen insensitivity syndrome, that had made their biological sex ambiguous at birth. Their chromosomes were XY, but their body had not responded normally to male hormones during development, resulting in external genitalia that appeared female while internal anatomy remained partially male. The medical team and Jordan's parents, Elena and Miguel Martinez, had been faced with the complex decision of how to assign gender and whether surgical intervention was necessary. Following medical protocols that were standard at the time, the doctors had recommended immediate surgical intervention to create more typically female-appearing genitalia, along with hormone therapy that would support female development during puberty. The decision had been presented to Elena and Miguel as medically necessary for Jordan's psychological and social well-being, with the understanding that early intervention would allow Jordan to be raised unambiguously as female and would prevent potential psychological trauma associated with having ambiguous genitalia. Elena and Miguel had made the decision to proceed with the recommended surgeries and hormone treatments, believing they were doing what was best for their child's future happiness and social acceptance. They had been told that Jordan would develop normally as a female, would be able to have typical relationships and social experiences, and would likely never need to know about the medical interventions that had been necessary to ensure normal development. But the reality of Jordan's experience had been far more complicated than anyone had anticipated. As Jordan had grown older, they had experienced increasing discomfort with their assigned female identity, feeling disconnected from their body and confused about their place in social and romantic relationships. During puberty, despite hormone therapy, Jordan had experienced physical and emotional changes that didn't align with typical female development, leading to questions about their medical history that their parents had initially been reluctant to answer fully. The revelation of Jordan's intersex condition and the extent of medical intervention they had undergone had come during Jordan's late teenage years, when medical complications had required them to see specialists who had explained the full scope of their medical history. Learning that their body had been surgically altered without their consent, that their hormone levels were being artificially maintained through medication, and that their assigned gender had been chosen by others rather than determined by their own identity, had created a profound crisis of self-understanding. Jordan had begun questioning everything they had been told about their body, their identity, and their future possibilities. They had researched intersex conditions and had discovered that many of the surgeries performed on intersex infants were now considered controversial, that there was growing recognition that these decisions should be delayed until individuals could participate in choices about their own bodies, and that many people who had undergone similar interventions as infants experienced ongoing physical and psychological complications. The most difficult aspect of Jordan's situation had been the recognition that their parents and doctors had made irreversible decisions about their body based on medical and social assumptions that Jordan did not share. While they understood that Elena and Miguel had been trying to do what they believed was best, Jordan had struggled with feeling that their bodily autonomy had been violated and that they had been denied the opportunity to make fundamental decisions about their own identity and physical development. Jordan had begun experimenting with different gender expressions and had found that they felt most comfortable identifying as non-binary rather than as either strictly male or female. This realization had created additional challenges because it meant that the surgery and hormone therapy they had undergone had been based on assumptions about their gender identity that proved to be incorrect, and because their family and social environment were not prepared to understand or support non-binary identity. The physical complications of Jordan's early medical interventions had also been significant. The surgeries had resulted in scarring and reduced sensation that affected their sexual function and body image. The hormone therapy had created ongoing medical dependence and had suppressed their body's natural hormone production. Most difficult to accept had been the recognition that these physical changes were irreversible and that Jordan would need to live with the consequences of decisions they had not made for the rest of their life. Elena and Miguel had struggled to understand Jordan's feelings about their medical history and gender identity. They had believed they were protecting Jordan by making difficult medical decisions when Jordan was too young to participate, and they had been confused and defensive when Jordan had expressed anger and resentment about those choices. They had interpreted Jordan's questions and gender exploration as ingratitude for the medical care they had received and as rejection of the family's efforts to provide a normal, happy life. The family dynamics around Jordan's intersex condition had been further complicated by cultural and religious factors. The Martinez family's traditional Catholic background had provided little framework for understanding intersex conditions or non-binary gender identity. Elena and Miguel had struggled with their own feelings of guilt and confusion about Jordan's condition, had worried about how extended family and community members would react, and had found it difficult to access resources and support for navigating these complex issues. Jordan had felt increasingly isolated within their own family and community, carrying questions about identity, sexuality, and medical ethics that few people in their environment could understand or address. They had sought support through online communities of intersex individuals, but had found that their particular combination of medical history and family dynamics created unique challenges that were difficult to address, even within supportive communities. The psychological impact of discovering the extent of medical intervention in their early life had been profound and ongoing. Jordan had experienced depression, anxiety, and symptoms of trauma related to feeling that their body had been altered without their consent. They had struggled with trust issues in relationships, both because of their complex medical history and because they had learned that even people who loved them had made decisions that felt like betrayals of their autonomy. Jordan had begun working with therapists who specialized in intersex issues and gender identity, and through this work had learned that their feelings of anger, confusion, and grief about their medical history were normal and valid responses to having fundamental decisions about their body and identity made by others. But they had also learned that healing would require finding ways to accept their current reality while advocating for their ongoing needs and identity. The Family Feud application had been submitted by Miguel Martinez, who had hoped that participating in a fun family activity might help improve the family's communication and help Jordan feel more connected to the family despite their recent struggles with identity and medical history. He had thought that focusing on positive family interaction might provide a foundation for better understanding of Jordan's needs and perspectives. During the pre-show preparations, Jordan had been quiet and somewhat withdrawn, participating appropriately but clearly carrying emotional weight that affected their energy and engagement with the experience. The production team had been impressed by Jordan's maturity and thoughtfulness, but had noticed that they seemed unusually serious and introspective for someone their age. The game had been proceeding with Jordan participating minimally while their parents engaged enthusiastically with Steve Harvey in the competitive aspects of the show. The Martinez family was competing against the Thompson family from Arizona, and while both sides had been playing with good energy, there was something restrained about Jordan's participation that suggested they were more focused on managing their internal state than on enjoying the game. But when it came time for the category decisions other people made that affected your whole life, and it was Jordan's turn at the buzzer, the question had struck directly at the heart of their experience and the ongoing struggle with bodily autonomy and identity that had defined their teenage years. Steve Harvey had approached the podium with his usual warm energy, but something about Jordan's serious demeanor and the weight they seemed to be carrying had made Steve more attentive and gentle than usual. "All right, Jordan," Steve had said softly, "decisions other people made that affected your whole life. What comes to mind?" Jordan had looked at their parents who were watching with love but also obvious anxiety about what Jordan might say, then back at Steve with the kind of careful honesty that comes from someone who has learned that truth-telling can be both liberating and dangerous. When I was born, the doctors and my parents decided what gender I would be, Jordan had said, their words carrying 19 years of questions about medical ethics, parental authority, and individual autonomy. They chose wrong, and now I have to live with consequences of a decision I never got to make. The studio had become very quiet as everyone present understood that they were hearing something profound about medical decision-making, gender identity, and the complex ethical questions surrounding treatment of intersex conditions. Steve had paused, clearly recognizing that this young person was sharing something deeply personal and complex. "Jordan," Steve had said gently, "can you help me understand what you mean?" Jordan had taken a breath, seeming to weigh how much detail to share with a television audience. "I was born intersex," Jordan had explained. "My body didn't fit typical male or female categories, so doctors and my parents had to choose. They chose female, did surgeries to make my body match that choice, and put me on hormones. But as I got older, I realized that's not who I am." The studio audience had listened with obvious attention and respect, understanding that they were learning about something most people rarely encounter or discuss. "How did you find out about the medical decisions that were made?" Steve had asked. "When I was 17, I had to see specialists for some complications," Jordan had said. "That's when I learned about all the surgeries I had as a baby, about the hormones I've been taking, about how much of my body had been changed before I could even talk." Steve had looked at Elena and Miguel Martinez, who were clearly emotional and struggling with the public discussion of such private family matters. "Mr. and Mrs. Martinez," Steve had said with obvious compassion, "how do you feel hearing Jordan share this?" "We thought we were doing what was best," Elena had said through tears. "The doctors said it was necessary. We wanted Jordan to have a normal life, to fit in, to be happy." Jordan had looked at their parents with a mixture of love and frustration. "I know you thought you were protecting me," Jordan had said gently. "But I wish I could have been part of the decision about my own body. I wish someone had waited to ask me what felt right." Steve had looked at Jordan with deep respect for their courage and maturity. "Jordan," Steve had said, "what you're describing raises really important questions about medical ethics and children's rights. How has this affected how you think about your identity and your future?" "I identify as non-binary now," Jordan had said. "I'm not male or female. I'm something in between, which actually matches my biology better than the female identity I was assigned. But figuring that out has been really hard because my body was changed to match a gender that doesn't fit who I am." Steve had begun removing his suit jacket, understanding that this moment required recognition of Jordan's courage and affirmation of their right to self-determination. "Jordan," Steve had said, placing the jacket around their shoulders, "this jacket represents something very important today. It represents your right to make decisions about your own identity, your own body, and your own future. Nobody else gets to decide who you are." Jordan had pulled the jacket closer, clearly moved by the gesture and the recognition of their autonomy. Steve had turned to address the studio audience. "Ladies and gentlemen," Steve had announced, "Jordan Martinez is teaching us something important about respect, autonomy, and the complexity of human identity. They're showing us that even well-intentioned decisions can have unintended consequences, and that every person deserves the right to participate in decisions about their own body and identity." The game had resumed with a completely different family dynamic, as Elena and Miguel began to understand that supporting Jordan meant accepting their identity and acknowledging that medical decisions made with the best intentions had created ongoing challenges that required ongoing support and understanding. When Steve had asked the final question about things that make you proud, Jordan had answered, "Learning to advocate for myself and my right to be who I really am." The episode aired 4 months later and became an important educational tool for families, medical professionals, and the general public about intersex conditions, medical ethics, and the importance of delaying irreversible medical interventions until individuals can participate in decisions about their own bodies. Jordan had kept Steve's jacket as a symbol of the moment when their autonomy was publicly recognized and affirmed. More importantly, they had begun building a new relationship with their family based on honest communication about their identity and needs, rather than assumptions about what would make them happy. The jacket represented Jordan's understanding that identity is personal and that the most important decisions about their body and future should be made by them rather than for them, and that healing from medical trauma requires both self-advocacy and family understanding. Because that's what autonomy looks like when it reclaims the right to self-determination. That's what identity sounds like when it chooses authenticity over convenience. And that's what happens when a 19-year-old person learns that their body belongs to them, that their identity is theirs to define, and that the most important medical decisions are the ones made with their full participation and consent. Jordan Martinez had been living with the consequences of decisions made without their input. But on that day at Family Feud, they discovered that they had the power to make their own choices about their identity, their body, and their future, and that the people who truly loved them could learn to support those choices even when they differed from earlier expectations.